This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Spain reports the lowest daily death toll from COVID-19 in 6 weeks. In South Africa, thousands queue for miles to get food parcels as lockdown continues. And Africa's journalists face pay cuts and safety concerns as coronavirus spreads. A warm welcome to Africa Live. I am Peninah Karibe, and with me in studio is Rama Nyang with the day's business headlines. Rama.
That's right, Peninah. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. Angola's state oil company, Sonangol, plans to offload some of its assets in readiness to be privatized. And Rwanda is seeking to postpone payment of its debt in order to create the fiscal room in order to cope with the COVID-19 pandemic. We'll have the details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Peninah.
Thank you, Rama. All right, so we begin this bulletin with some news. Justin, Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has tested positive for COVID-19. We shall be bringing you those details within this hour. Spain has seen its lowest number of COVID-19 deaths in 6 weeks. It reported 268 deaths on Thursday, bringing the total to more than 24,500. This as the country prepares to ease lockdown measures, but the economic toll continues to grow. New numbers show Spain's economy shrunk by 5% so far this year, and the International Monetary Fund estimates it could drop by 8% for the year. In France, nursing homes have been particularly hard hit by the pandemic, with tens of thousands of positive cases and more than 9,000 deaths so far. Authorities have started to allow some family visits to care homes, though tight restrictions will remain in place for relatives, such as a total ban on physical contact. CGTN's Rose Cullen reports.
Singing together and lifting spirits. At care homes in France, visits from relatives are now allowed, though only under strict conditions. Even without physical contact, just seeing family members can light up the day for people in nursing homes. Life in such accommodation is tough under normal circumstances, routines already restricted, and lockdown conditions now making daily life much harder.
We spend all our days between these four walls. That's it. We're not allowed to go out, not even to the corridor. They bring us breakfast, lunch and dinner here in the room. Luckily, the sun shines through the window, but we miss the essential things.
Some elderly people are still able to live at home, though this presents other challenges for their carers.
Some of our patients have a partner, but others are alone. No one comes to their house for shopping or cleaning. They're extremely lonely, so we try to chat and talk about things other than the virus. But it's not easy because the news about the disease is on repeat everywhere, and so they do get worried.
Many older people have underlying medical conditions that make them particularly vulnerable to the disease. They've also been affected psychologically, cut off from social and family ties. The government is trying to protect older people with a massive programme of medical screening.
The government's constantly weighing up people's mental well-being versus their physical health. And despite the relaxation of rules, they are concerned about the number of deaths in care homes. And so there's little chance of full freedom for those living in such homes like this one anytime soon.
And workers in nursing homes have to be tested because there have been positive cases in supported accommodation across France. Carers have to communicate through face masks and goggles, distressing barriers for people who rely on human warmth.
In France, I think our elderly aren't top priorities. Sadly, maybe we needed something as huge as a global virus that kills people across the world to realise the failings and weaknesses in care homes and the health system.
This easing of the rules around visits from relatives will hopefully lift the mood among residents, even if the lockdown conditions continue for now. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa, in his capacity as the chairperson of the African Union, held a virtual meeting with chairpersons of the AU regional economic communities. The meeting provided the chairs with an update on the steps undertaken by the AU Bureau to combat the coronavirus. CGTN's Elisa Njamela has more.
The AU Chair Cyril Ramaphosa first commended the continent's leaders for their commitment in fighting COVID-19, but warned that on the African continent, the peak of infections will only hit later.
While the numbers of infections in Africa at this time is lower than elsewhere in the world, we expect that the peak of infections in Africa will definitely come later, and this is what the science is telling us, and this will be with devastating consequences.
The AU Chair says this therefore calls for extraordinary measures to be implemented on this continent.
At this time, it is also vital that we intensify efforts to end all forms of violence, destabilization, and terrorism on our continent. If we are to be successful in overcoming the coronavirus pandemic, we need to work even harder to silence the guns and to ensure that they remain silent.
The AU has also undertaken various measures to contain the spread of the virus and to mitigate the economic fallout that will be caused by the virus.
Among other things, your bureau agreed to establish the AU COVID-19 Response Fund, a drive to raise additional funds for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and intensify the lobbying from the international community for a comprehensive, robust economic stimulus package for Africa. To date, we have managed to raise $25 million for the Response Fund and an additional $36.5 million for the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Ramaphosa also announced that the AU regional economic communities have held meetings with various stakeholders to discuss robust economic stimulus packages to assist the continent. Ramaphosa acknowledged the pressing need for ventilators, health workers, and other medical supplies for the continent. He further appealed to world leaders to assist Africa in this regard. Yolisa Njamela for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Staying in South Africa, thousands of residents in Centurion lined up on Wednesday to receive food parcels. The country is currently under a coronavirus lockdown. Local businesses donated 8,000 food hampers to residents of Moy Plus, an informal settlement. Initiatives like these are looking to cushion the economic impact of the country's lockdown. South Africa currently has one of the highest numbers of confirmed cases on the continent. Miles-long lines for food in South Africa have become a daily occurrence. Now, Libya's East-based commander, General Khalifa Haftar, has announced that his forces will halt fighting over Ramadan. But reports just in indicate that the UN-backed government in Tripoli has rejected the offer of a truce. Early in the week, Haftar declared himself leader of Libya by popular mandate. The unilateral move has been rejected by neighboring Tunisia, as Adnan Shawashi reports.
President Kais Saied reaffirmed Tunisia's support to international legitimacy and the need to respect the choice of the Libyan people, stressing Tunisia's opposition to any breach to Libyan unity.
The president insists on Tunisia's attachment to international legality in order to reach a political settlement in Libya that respects the will of the Libyan people.
There have been international appeals for humanitarian truce amid the coronavirus pandemic, but it's not clear how long ceasefire will hold. Tunisian Foreign Minister added that Carthage will not tolerate any military escalation in the neighboring country.
Tunisia rejects any breach to Libya's territorial unity and integrity. The head of state insists on the political settlement that must be an inter-Libyan dialogue and solution based on internal agreement without any foreign interference.
The Commission of Defense and Security at the House of the People's Representatives has held an emergency meeting. MPs have warned against the impact of the war in Libya on security and stability in the North African region.
The Tunisian state and its security institutions are on alert. Tunisia is ready for all scenarios, especially on the border with Libya. We're expecting a wave of migrants following the armed conflict. We are prepared, while we are insisting on a peaceful settlement with our brother country.
The head of state has approved the government's plan to accelerate the repatriation plan of around 1,500 Tunisians stranded in Libya, given the dangerous security situation in the North African state. Tunisian authorities have urged all Libyan parties to comply with the Security Council resolutions and to respect the legal institutions recognized internationally as provided for in the Libyan political agreement. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
The Intergovernmental Authority on Development has been urging South Sudanese President Salva Kiir to dissolve the country's parliament. The deadline set a week ago by the regional body expired on Thursday, the 30th of April. IGAD also said new legislature should be in place within 10 days after the dissolution of the current parliament. The formation of a new parliament is one among the tasks to implement the country's revitalized peace deal made in 2018. The agreement was signed by President Kiir, former rebel leader Riek Machar, and other opposition movements. CGTN's Patrick Oyet explains that an outstanding issue on the division of states is what's preventing the dissolution of parliaments.
Dissolution of the parliament itself is not actually a big issue according to the government officials and other parties that are negotiating the issues of parliament here. They are saying the problem comes down to the issue of states because the parties are still disagreeing on the issue of states. How? The agreement, for example, gives 55% of the states to President Salva Kiir, 27% to opposition group now, Vice President Riek Machar, and so on. But when it comes to the meaning itself, the plain meaning of those percentage is where the problem is, because there are 10 states. What does 55% mean? Does it mean 5.5 states? Then what is 5.5 states in reality? Then for the opposition leader Riek Machar, 27%. What does it mean? 2.7 states. So there was a problem with the plain interpretation of those provisions in the agreement. Then not only that, also when you agree that, okay, now let the opposition take 2, let this one take 6 and so on, then which states are you going to give to who? Because there are also issues here. There are states that produce, for example, oil. There are states that are bordering other countries. They generate revenue, yet there are states that do not generate any much revenue. Now, who is going to take which state? This is directly connected to the issue of parliament in the sense that if I am going to provide you a list of members of parliament that are coming to represent my party, I must know from which state I am bringing them, because that state must be under me. If not, then I cannot provide you with any list. So that is where the problem is. The problem is that if the issue of states are not resolved, then the issue of parliament is also likely not to be resolved. It is supposed to be negotiated appointment. It is supposed to be once they agree on the issue of states, then each party now will have to sit and come up with a list of people they want to represent them in the parliament, provide that list to the presidency. The presidency will sit down, debate it. When they agree, then they will be announced. If the members are announced, then they will go to parliament, swear in, elect their speakers, deputy speakers. So basically is a negotiated settlement, no elections for now.
Let's update you on that breaking news. The Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has tested positive for COVID-19. He has informed President Vladimir Putin that he will self-isolate. The First Deputy Prime Minister Andrei Belousov will perform the Prime Minister's duties. Mishustin was named Prime Minister in January. We shall be bringing you more on this as the details emerge. You're watching Africa Live. We're taking a short break. We'll be right back with more. Don't go far. All measures taken by African governments to control the spread of COVID-19 have had far-reaching socio-economic impacts. CGTN is airing a series of stories on how the outbreak has affected different segments of society. Today, we're focusing on how the pandemic has affected the media industry on the continent. So we begin in South Africa. The country's newspaper industry may be feeling the heat of the coronavirus lockdown, but online news platforms and streaming services have had a massive boost. Most of the country is still being asked to stay at home as the number of COVID-19 cases surpasses 5,000. CGTN's Julie Shire has more.
A lean selection of newspapers line a stand at a convenience store in South Africa. Home deliveries are banned and sales have slumped since the onset of the coronavirus outbreak in March.
So we've seen newspapers still come out physically, but with much smaller editions and with much smaller circulation. And that's going to have a long-term impact because the profitability has always been marginal in this country. And now we're going to see them going into massive losses.
Even before the coronavirus, the industry wasn't doing well as readers were going online for news. And now with the economic fallout of the pandemic and advertising budgets shrinking, it's unlikely many local newspapers will survive.
The one thing that we know about a depressed economy, whether it's in recession or full depression, the first thing that gets cancelled is the marketing budget. And news websites or news publications that are dependent on advertising for their survival will feel that immediately.
Unlike any other crisis, the impact of COVID-19 is being felt in every household. Anxious South Africans may be reading less, but they're streaming more.
Because its impact is so universal, you see people flocking to news websites. If you're able to break news and provide a credible, trusted organization when people know they can go for the facts, then there's opportunity there. But the question is, yes, how do you monetize that? And that's the tricky thing, because South Africans have shown that they're just not willing to pay for news.
We don't have numbers yet for how much internet use is increasing in South Africa, but we can certainly tell from what the mobile operators are saying about demand on their networks. And typically, they're reporting around a 15% increase in utilization of the network capacity. And for this reason, the regulator has issued emergency spectrum to all the operators.
Internet streaming has shot up as COVID-19 keeps large parts of the world at home. South Africa is expected to see a similar boost, with population movements still heavily restricted. Julie Shire, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
In Kenya, the media industry, like many others, has been forced to implement measures to cushion themselves against the impact of COVID-19 on their businesses. Some media houses are laying off staff, while others have opted to slash salaries to survive. And as CGTN's Robert Nagila reports, the industry remains uncertain about its future.
Emmanuel Yegon is a freelance journalist based in Kenya, focusing on solution-based stories filmed with a smartphone. He says since the outbreak of COVID-19, work from local and international outlets has dried up.
COVID-19 is changing a lot of things, yeah, and we have to try to adjust to the new normal.
COVID-19 has had a huge impact on many sectors across the country, and nowhere is that more apparent than the local media industry, with those who go out to gather the news, journalists, bearing the brunt. Several privately owned media outlets have asked their staff to take pay cuts ranging from 20 to 50%. Ironically, local TV viewership has increased as more Kenyans seek information on the pandemic. A recent poll on media consumption locally found that average television viewership increased by 335,000 viewers to 7.9 million. So why is business so bad? Experts point to dwindling advertising revenue.
Advertising is a major source of income for media houses, not just in Kenya, but all over the world. However, there appears to be a dip in the spending curve over the past 2 to 3 years.
Industry insiders, however, say the downward spiral began much earlier.
We had seen layoffs before this issue came. We had seen redundancies, and we had even a lot of people who had not been paid their salaries. That is before this came. So I think when this came, it was simply, let's call it a last nail in a coffin.
Employees from at least one of the outlets, K24 TV, owned by MediaMax Network, have sued their employer over the proposed pay cuts. Experts say both sides need to be accommodating.
It's unfortunate, but employees need to understand that this is also affecting the business. So there's the option of, do we keep you on board, cannot sustain you a few months down the line and the business closes, or do we help each other to share the damage that is being caused or brought about by COVID-19?
With no end in sight to the pandemic, what the future holds for the industry is uncertain. Worse still, for freelance journalists like Emmanuel, these are uncharted waters.
We are hopeful, though, that this will end soon. That's just our prayer.
Hope is a word the industry is clinging on. Hope that things improve and do so quickly. Robert Nakela, CGTN, Nairobi, Kenya.
Measures to stem the coronavirus pandemic have affected the distribution and publication of newspapers in Tunisia. Owners of 7 daily newspapers and 20 weeklies have suspended their publications in recent days. CGTN's Adnan Shawashi has the details.
Zubair is one of the oldest newspaper sellers in the capital city Tunis. His few remaining clients have deserted the shop because the newsstand is empty for the 4th consecutive week. The 63-year-old man says he has never experienced such a crisis.
I've been selling newspapers for decades. This crisis has no equal. The newspapers are not available. I'm very pessimistic because people will fear the contagion from paper. They think the virus is everywhere.
The president of the Tunisian Federation of Newspaper Directors says that all newspapers will disappear if the authorities do not intervene by providing an emergency package to pay the salaries of journalists.
All newspapers and magazines without exception have stopped printing. The general lockdown has complicated the situation. Advertising revenues are suspended and even the state is no longer buying publications. It's the end of newspapers if an urgent package is not provided to save the sector.
Nizar Makni still believes in the future of the industry if owners choose to move forward to digitize all newspapers. The journalist has been authorized to work at As-Sabah Daily offices, while his colleagues are working from home. Nizar clings to journalism, but he's aware that the media sector in general will not easily recover from the COVID-19 crisis.
The coronavirus crisis will decimate the newspaper industry. The worst is yet to come if the state does not create a fund for digital journalism to finance the transition. Now, even the online newspapers are at risk, but at least they can reach their readership.
Many people view writing articles on social, economic and political events and covering stories during the pandemic as an act of resistance. In fact, Tunisian journalists in the private sector continue writing even when faced with the difficult choices between salary reduction and compulsory leave. Tunisian newspaper publishers have found it economically unsustainable to go on producing papers. In addition, according to the High Independent Communication Authority, the crisis has also hit the television, radio and entertainment industries in the North African country. Adnan Shawashi, CGTN, Tunis.
The coronavirus pandemic is also impacting Egypt's media industry. A number of printed dailies have been cancelled, and newspaper vendors and salesmen risk losing their jobs. CGTN's Adel Mahrouri has more.
For 32 years, Ahmed Saleh has had an unchanged daily routine. He'd wake up by dawn to arrange his collection of magazines and newspapers and start delivering interesting reads to hundreds every day. But COVID-19 has tarnished his well-established workflow.
The homes and companies which I used to be contracted with monthly have asked me to postpone delivering the newspapers. The sales for people in the streets who used to come daily before the coronavirus has dropped to about 40% of the usual. They'd come once or twice a week maybe.
Moreover, the night curfew in Egypt has forced him to work less hours. It has also stopped the number of editions released later in the day. That has decreased his income even more.
I am worried. I must be. I am afraid. I pray that the number of COVID-19 infection doesn't get bigger. If it does, the country will shut down. I have nowhere else to go.
In the financial cycle of printing news, Salah and the 5 family members in his household are the weakest link. With every extension to the partial lockdown, he suffers more. With a lot of free time on his hand, Salah turns to reading. He opens the newspaper hoping one day he reads a title saying the crisis is over. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Journalists in Tanzania have had to change the way they work due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The country's government has discouraged them from physically attending press briefings, urging them to shift to using press releases or video conferences. The pandemic has also changed the focus of their stories. Let's hear what one journalist has to say about the changes.
The major story these days is COVID-19. There are a few stories that aren't about it. The number of those infected has increased, whether it has decreased, those who have recovered. Those are the stories. So we get creative in order to report, but work is not as it used to be. Some people refuse interviews these days. When they see that you're a journalist, they know that you meet many people in a day. They feel that the risk of contracting the disease from you is greater than interacting with anybody else.
China and South Africa have long maintained close ties, especially during the coronavirus pandemic. The strength of this relationship was recently demonstrated when one South African business approached the Chinese government for help with scarce personal protective equipment and other medical supplies. CGTN's Angela Kupla picks up this story.
As more and more countries became infected, so the demand for personal protective equipment began to outstrip supply.
3 weeks ago, the chairman of NASPAS, Mr. Kusbeker, wrote to me, to request our assistance to facilitate the medical supplies from China to South Africa. And for that, I'm more than happy to do that, because South Africa and China, we are strategic partners, and we have been helping each other all the time.
NASPAS is one of many South African businesses that heeded the call from President Ramaphosa, ensuring that supply meets the specific needs of the country.
We've got a team that's focused on this, and they liaise with the Department of Health continuously. And so they were the ones who told us what we must buy specifically and where it must go. So the initial PPE that came in has gone into various hospitals around the country, all taken through by Take-A-Lot. And so with this PPE that's come in now of 6 million masks, those are now going through to the various hospitals around the country where they have been allocated to by the Department of Health.
The country's president has been leading from the front and making time to thank everyone who's rolled up their sleeves and got involved.
We're truly grateful that we have corporations like NASPAS and many others who have decided that they are going to lend a hand and assist our whole effort of fighting COVID-19. But we are also grateful to China for continuing to supply these medical supplies that we so need.
It's all about teamwork. It's about the private sector getting involved to fill up those gaps that are left by the public sector, and it's about fighting that virus. We all pull together, we can get this job done. I'm Angelo Coppola for CGTN in Johannesburg, South Africa.
Well, it's time now for the day's business news with Rama.
Thank you very much, Peninah. Here's what's coming up in business. Angola's state oil company Sonangol plans to offload some of its assets in readiness for privatization. And Rwanda seeks to postpone payments of its debt in order to create fiscal room to deal with the pandemic.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back. Let's start with Africa's second largest oil producer, Angola. Its state oil company, Sonangol, has opened a public tender to sell its stakes in some private entities. This is all part of the government's efforts to privatize critical state assets, including parts of Sonangol itself, by 2022. Now, among the stakes that the company is shedding off include a 30% stake in Petromar, Sonadiet Limited and Sonadiet Services, about a third of a stake in SBM Shipyard, 40% of Sonamet Industrial and Sonergy Services and Construction Petroleum Limited, as well as a majority stake in Sonatide Marine and Sonatide Marine Angola. Now, Angola will also release either full or part ownership of 81 companies this year through public tenders. Of these, 6 will be auctioned and 3 will be sold through IPOs. 12 of those are set to be privatized next year and another 4 in 2022. In East Africa, Rwanda is seeking the suspension of its debt repayments for at least 2 years in order to deal with the economic impacts of the global COVID-19 pandemic. President Paul Kagame said that the economy will probably only grow by 3.5% this year. That's much lower than an earlier projection of at least 8% growth in 2020. It's for that reason that the Rwandese president is negotiating with lenders to delay repayments and instead use that money to stimulate economic activity instead. Rwanda is one of the African countries that has stepped up its fight against the virus. It's seeking to cushion its citizens and the economy against the pandemic that continues to take a toll on businesses. It has organized for the door-to-door distribution of food, the provision of free water and electricity, alongside free medical supplies for her citizens. The American credit ratings agency S&P has lowered South Africa's sovereign credit rating further into junk territory. S&P said that the country's already contracting economy will face a further sharp COVID-19 related downturn this year. It now, in fact, expects that South Africa's economic output will shrink by 4.5% this year, which is still optimistic compared to the 6.1% contraction forecast by the South African Central Bank. The agency expects that the headline fiscal deficit will also widen to 13.3% of GDP in 2020, leading to net debt levels rising to over 75% of output by the end of the year. S&P's latest rating action comes just over a month since Moody's, the rival ratings agency, downgraded South Africa's sovereign credit rating into junk, citing a deterioration in South Africa's fiscal strength and very weak growth. And we're still in South Africa, where Moody's has again raised red flags about South African banks. The agency just last month, as we just mentioned, downgraded the country's big banks into junk, noting their massive exposure to the sovereign debt book. Here's CGTN's Sumitra Naidu taking up the story.
South Africa's financial system has always been praised for its strong regulatory and legal frameworks, but the poor state of the economy is causing a strain.
The negative outlook on the banking sector is tied to the negative outlook on the economy. The economic outlook has dimmed significantly due to the impact of COVID-19.
International ratings agency Fitch also downgraded South Africa's big banks. Both agencies are worried that the commercial banks have way too much state exposure, more especially with the state-owned entities.
The South African banking sector is under a great deal of pressure. They are not going to be as stable and as creditworthy as they were, before the pandemic, and that's something I think we had to anticipate. South Africans are going to have a great deal less money, and therefore are going to be less able to pay back their loans, and that's going to make them more difficult for banks to basically make profits, because they're going to have more loans that they're going to have to write off, and it's going to be difficult for banks to actually find opportunities to outperform in this environment.
The Reserve Bank expects the economy to contract over 6.5% in 2020. The bank warned of a deep recession for this year and next before a recovery.
But unfortunately, there is not much that the South African Reserve Bank can do or the banking sector locally can do relating to what is clearly a sharp contraction in economic activity.
The Reserve Bank has bought close to $1 billion worth of bonds in order to stabilize the market and keep liquidity flowing with commercial banks. The Treasury has also put in place an economic plan to keep industries alive.
These stimulus packages are basically a flood of money into the economy just to boost things again. In South Africa, politicians are trying to use these for means not just to return the economy to its feet, but also to achieve certain social justice gains, and that may not be feasible considering just how bad the economic downturn has been.
Moody's acknowledged that government's interventions will provide some support to the South African economy, but went ahead and further downgraded its outlook on the banks, raising concerns about rising debt levels. Sumitra Nadu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
The European Commission has signalled potential flexibility over rules that airline passengers must be offered a choice between either a cash refund or a voucher for any cancelled flight. Airlines, of course, have been hit very, very hard by this pandemic, and some say they simply cannot afford to offer passengers refunds. CGTN's Tony Waterman has more from Brussels.
This is really the first indication yet that there may be some flexibility with the EU passengers' rights, which Brussels likes to hold up as the international gold standard of consumer protection. That regulation clearly states that if a trip or a flight is canceled for whatever reason, that a traveler is entitled to a full cash refund. But that is not happening right now. A lot of these cash-strapped tour operators and also airlines are offering vouchers instead, and vouchers, which I may add, have expiration dates that are not that far off in the future. On top of that, you have a number of countries which are bypassing this rule by adopting emergency measures. Portugal, Italy, Spain, Belgium, just to name a few of them. Now, this is a very sensitive topic for travelers. They feel that their rights have perhaps been violated, that they're now going to be paying twice, not only for that potentially non-refundable ticket, but also with their tax money to bail out these airlines and these tour operators. From the tour operators and the airlines' point of view, they are hemorrhaging billions of dollars, so they may not exactly have the money right now to be handing out. No decision has been made, but take a listen to what the Commission Vice President had to say earlier today.
In order to address the liquidity crisis, it is important to clarify the rules applicable to refunds and the use of vouchers in case of COVID-19 related cancellations under the Passenger Rights Regulations and the Package Travel Directive. Action to make vouchers more attractive to consumers can help to ease the pressure on operators while ensuring full respect of consumer rights.
The Commission is expected to put out a full set of guidelines around the resumption of travel in Europe in mid-May, so perhaps by then we'll be getting a clearer indication of what the final decision is. Tony Waterman, CGTN, Brussels.
Now on to the struggling auto industry. Daimler and Volkswagen on Wednesday urged the German government to help boost demand for their products, essentially cars. That plea came before the German Chancellor Angela Merkel prepared to host a summit with auto sector leaders to discuss how to revive the industry. VW Chief Financial Officer Frank Witter said that car companies need a swift decision on buyer incentives, not just in this crisis, but thereafter as well. VW's first quarter car sales were down by over 20% year on year, and that caused their earnings to fall by over 80%. As some factories are ramping up production, car makers are saying their priority is to figure out how to rekindle demand. CGTN's Iris Bitter has that story.
Europe's largest car maker is getting back to the business of mass-producing vehicles. But in the age of coronavirus, Volkswagen's factory floor looks a bit different. With plants reopening around Europe after a month-long shutdown, VW and others are gradually ramping up production. But customer demand is a major problem due to the pandemic. Analysts are predicting declines of as much as 18% this year.
And then comes the question, how many orders do we have? It makes no sense to just produce cars without having people to buy them, without customers.
Still, VW says it expects to turn a profit in 2020, although it warned that it would be far below last year's. The auto industry is critical to Germany's economy. It employs more than 800,000 people, and German companies are the third largest producers of passenger cars in the world. The industry's struggles are one of the reasons why Europe's largest economy is bracing for a major slowdown.
We're expecting the economy of the Federal Republic of Germany to shrink by 6.3% this year, or around 6%, and that it will recover next year by about 5.2%.
One thing Germany's car industry can look to for getting back on track is its experience in China, where it produces more vehicles than it does at home. Factories there have largely reopened, incorporating new safety measures and other adjustments.
There are important factories and important plants in China. There's been a lot of experience now through China on how to revive the market bit by bit.
China remains the critical growth market for German car makers, who also face major financial pressure from the shift toward electric vehicles.
China is the key. It's the most important country for the auto industry, and in the future, if you don't have electric cars in China, you will lose in China.
For VW and others, trying to take some of the bite out of the virus's economic impact is the first step. Ira Spetzer, CGTN, Berlin.
And I will leave it there for the time being. But I'll be back at the top of the hour. We've been hearing a lot about the tens of billions of dollars being raised in order to fund coronavirus responses right across Africa. But how transparent are governments here in how this money is going to be used? We'll explore that and plenty more at 1800 GMT. See you then. For now, back to Peninah.
Thank you, Rama. You're watching Africa Live. Still ahead after this break. Egyptian entrepreneurs find unique ways to stay afloat while preserving jobs and salaries.
The greatest journeys, the greatest sights, the greatest adventures.
Here in Qanater, this weir allows the locals to walk on water.
We're far more than just TV news. We're your passport to the wonders of Africa.
To bring you stories of struggle, survival and hope.
So let's explore. CGTN. See the difference.
April 30th is World Jazz Day, but the celebrations were cancelled due to the coronavirus pandemic. Musicians have been hit hard by the outbreak, which has prevented them from performing in front of crowds. But Uganda's jazz players are finding ways to keep themselves occupied, as CGTN's Leon Senyange reports.
Joseph Kizito plays along to a popular Ugandan song. The melodious sounds soothe his neighborhood. Music was his full-time job until the coronavirus pandemic broke out. And the outbreak has put a damper on World Jazz Day celebrations.
Shows have been called off. We had something big we were going to do, but because of the COVID-19 crisis, we had to push it further.
But the pandemic has not been all bad for Kizito. A month-long lockdown has given him time to focus on developing his craft.
You get to discover more things, you play more at home, you listen more, and then also composing. So a lot has really gone on. That's why you will notice that after this whole thing, so many people will be releasing albums.
While musicians work on new compositions, it may be a while before they find themselves in front of an audience. Any performances now may compromise the health of musicians and their fans. Although the lockdown restrictions are expected to be eased, performers may still have to wait to hit the stage. For Michael Chitanda, the time off has given him an opportunity to get back to the basics.
I've been doing a lot of music reading, and then I've been doing a lot of music production.
Yeah, because I'm actually working on an album right now. It's almost done.
Chitanda was also scheduled to be part of the Jazz Day celebrations here. The day will be celebrated virtually.
Jazz is typically expressing yourself. It's typically playing what is on your heart, more like a freestyle. So to us the musicians, you really it's a way of like letting out what you feel.
Jazz is a popular music genre here and can help manage mental stress while people wait for life to return to normal. Leon Sanyanga, CGTN, Kampala, Uganda.
The coronavirus pandemic has resulted in many Egyptian businesses cutting costs, but two young entrepreneurs with a chain of pastry shops are finding new ways to stay afloat while preserving salaries and jobs. This despite having to shut all their branches amid the lockdown. Here's CGTN's Adel Mahri with more.
This Egyptian brand is known for its mouth-watering desserts. In recent years, it's been among the fastest growing chains industry until COVID-19 has hit.
2019 ended fantastically, and we had started the year as well very solid, great. We had fantastic projections. Beginning of March, thankfully we still had the growth. We have a regular around 37% growth. We saw that growth decline in March to 9%. And then suddenly people started to be aware in Egypt of the whole coronavirus, that our sales went down, like from at least the growth of 8%, it went down 70%. And then we had to for the security of our employees, we closed down.
This chain began with one cupcakes shop in 2010. Today, Adel and his sister manage 28 outlets. This branch is the latest addition to the Nola family. It had only operated for a few days, and then a poster on its door said they had closed until further notice. The government had shut shops on weekends and imposed a night curfew. But the owners decided to keep all the jobs and salaries for their staff, despite the vague future the pandemic provided.
At Nola, we were partners, we support each other, we're a family, all of us, and we're in this together. So at least, it's something out of all of our hands, and from our side, we're trying to be. We want to support our employees as much as we can.
With 350 employees working for them, it's been a huge financial commitment for the young entrepreneurs. Luckily for them, the government has lifted many of its COVID-19 commercial restrictions right before the month of Ramadan began.
Ramadan is the most important month for our business. Basically, it's an additional quarter to our sales. We basically work our year around how we're going to maximize our sales, how we're going to enhance operations, how we're going to develop new products.
To cope with the lockdown, they've approached supermarkets to display their products there. Still, they had to prepare more creative market entry strategies to survive through the pandemic.
We're working on products that we could place in the supermarket, like ready-made cake mixes, and you have a pan, like a cupcake pan, and you place them, you can bake them yourself. So this is how we're starting to think, because what happens if now after Ramadan they go back to the same measures we started off with.
The night curfew has cost them 20% of their Ramadan sales, which is not bad at all given the circumstances. At least they're now prepared with a plan B if Egypt needs to take harsher measures against COVID-19. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
Ahead in sports. Nigeria's circus group adapts to stay alive despite lockdown.
How would you create your legend? On the fields, on the tracks, in the arenas of Africa. Were you born to be a player? Could this moment be yours? sports scene. Find your game.
Acrobats are known for their extraordinary performances, but since the outbreak of COVID-19, Nigeria's circus groups have shut down operations and training sessions with students. But it appears that one group has found a way to stay alive, as CGTN's Deji Badmas tells us.
Ekpowam Edem is an acrobat, juggler and hula hooper. She founded Nigeria's first circus group, Paratrak Circus, which organizes various circus camps and workshops, mostly for students. With most of her students now stuck at home, she connects with a group of circus artist friends in 4 different countries to provide fitness training for interested persons during the COVID-19 lockdown.
If we're staying at home all the time, it means that we're not moving as much. So now you really have to take the initiative to move. It is super duper important right now to do as much exercise as possible to keep your body healthy and to also just free your mind. If you're always there thinking and thinking and thinking, you're overworking your brain. It's time to transfer some of that energy to your body and use it.
That's exactly what she's trying to help people achieve. Edem records herself training and then posts it online via Instagram and YouTube. The routines involve core-strengthening exercises like the plank before moving on to headstands. She makes these sessions fun, using step-by-step tutorials with voice prompt accompanied with subtle music.
Hold it for 10 seconds. Then finally you take your legs all the way up.
We do our Instagram live sessions, and we have people that come and just watch briefly. There are a few people who say that they're also working on it in their homes. There's no way for us to verify. But at the same time, something that I do is that I make short videos and put them on YouTube for people that I know personally, so that in their own time, they can try to exercise.
It's not very easy for Edem and her Paratrak Circus at this time. They are not able to do shows or organize sessions for children to make money, but she's resolved not to let this get to her.
We were probably the first people to lose our work because we work mostly with children and we work at events. And events were the first things to go, and children's schools closed and children's classes stopped. So all our work stopped, or at least all our paid work stopped. Mostly now we are living off the goodwill and generosity of people that know us. But we're not worried, we're not anxious. It has not been easy, but we are making the most of it.
This period has also been a blessing in disguise for Edem. Apart from gaining more followers on social media, she's also using the opportunity of the lockdown to train more and learn new movements, which can then be passed on to her students when this is finally over. Deji Badmos, CGTN, Abuja, Nigeria.
Italy's Prime Minister announced over the weekend that teams can return to training on May 18th. This means, in theory, that Serie A could resume games in June behind closed doors. But France became the first of Europe's top 5 leagues to call off its season on Tuesday. And Italy's Sports Minister Vincenzo Spadafora says that the rest of the continent could soon do the same. Italy's top-flight football league has been suspended since last month when a nationwide lockdown was imposed in response to COVID-19.
I always said that resuming training does not necessarily mean resuming the season. I understand some people saying it does, but that leaves all of us with uncertainty. So if we don't want uncertainty, then we need